My road trip companion.
It's kind of my quiet alone time.
Audible is a routine for me.
It's like a fun night school for adults.
I could easily be seduced into locking myself in a place where I do nothing but listen to books.
I never was interested in historical fiction before, but I'm obsessed with it now.
There are a lot of classic and big titles that I feel like I missed out. Since I don't have time to read, might as well listen.
If I want to catch up on the news or history or learn what's going on in the world, I can download a book and listen to it.
Because I listened to her story over and over again, I made the decision to go ahead and follow my own dream, which was to help other veterans.
I think there's like 180 books in my library now. It changes your perspective. It makes you a different person.
It's true. It's so true.
Download Audible and start listening today.
Hello and welcome tonight. I'm Sandy Banks. I'm currently a columnist at the LA Times, but I've been there for more than 30 years as an editor, a reporter, and an editorial writer. Thank you all for tuning in to the 25th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, Memoirs of the Black Experience. I'm pleased to introduce you to the three authors who'll be joining our discussion tonight. We have Emily Bernard. She's the Christopher Isherwood Prize-winner for her book, Black is the Body. Acclaimed cultural critic Morgan Jerkins, whose new book is Wandering in Strange Lands. And Frank Wilderson, who is the 2020 National Book Award longlist finalist for his book, Afro-Pessimism. We're going to be discussing race, family, legacy, and historical and current social conditions in the Black community. Before we get to our conversation, though, I want to remind everybody to support your local independent bookstores during this festival. Book Soup is the seller for this event. Please buy your books through them because you'll get signed book plates from all three of the writers. Now, Emily, Morgan, and Frank, welcome. I want to talk about the similarities and the differences in your book. I have read them all and found them fascinating. And they all deal with being an outsider in a way, whether that's by circumstance or condition or just the mere existence and fact of our Black skin. But they're all very different. And I'm going to be reading small passages just to let our audience know kind of the essence of your book, or at least as I found it. And I want to start with you, Emily. Your book is a very emotional book. And it is a memoir in kind of the conventional sense where you're taking us through your life, but you're also making points that connect us to the broader Black experience. In fact, all of you are. And I want to ask you, you go to some pretty emotional terrain here. I want to ask how hard that was for you and what you think that adds to memoir writing. And I'd like to read just a little brief piece from you about the importance of race. And it is, in my family, race was not a construction or a theory or an outdated consequence of history, but the active living foundation of our reality. Race determined the contours of every choice we made. Every mundane public act was performed as a project with a name. When we moved into our house, it was called integration. When my older brother and I entered the public school system, it was called desegregation. The split between Black and white was not metaphorical. Railroad tracks divided Black and white Nashville. You had a rather unconventional upbringing and life now. So can you talk to us a little about how that informs your book and what it felt like to write?
Thank you, Sandy. And it's really a pleasure to be here tonight on the panel with Frank and Morgan. This is really, I wish we could be together right now to have this conversation. My book took a long time to write. There were just certain things, I think, experiences I had to live through before I could write about them. And I always think of myself as a slow writer. So there were moments in the book that I experienced, years before I found out where they fit, in a narrative. And my book is informed not only by my own experience, which is, a particular experience, my own life, but also a larger experience. To me, the book is really an homage to my maternal ancestry, my mother and my grandmother, my great-grandmother, without whom it would not be possible for me to be sitting here tonight. And I'm aware of that all of the time. And my racial identity has evolved and taken on new layers as I've become a mother. And right now I can say that the book is so different from the book maybe I would write now, because it is, my perspective has obviously shifted, and my experiences have shifted, not only with our current political situation, but really becoming a mother to two teenage girls who are finding their way in the murky waters of identity, racial identity in this country. And so it evolves, but really the book is, I think, that question about how much of my own identity is informed and constructed by the stories that came before me, and how much of our identities do we invent? I mean, it's a question I find very intriguing. I don't know if it's one that we can ever answer, but it was something I wanted to spend time with. And that's a thread that really connects these essays, those larger questions about identity.
I think it also connects these books is the larger questions about identity. And Morgan, I know for you, your memoir was kind of a search for identity. It was a way to kind of figure out who you were. And you have meticulously kind of walked us through a search that I think a lot of us go on these days, as we want to know what our ancestry is like. And your question that prompted you to do this, you had a mother, you grew up in the North in New Jersey, felt that was kind of who you were, and then found out your father had come from the South. And these were the kind of stories that, like for so many of us, we don't know when we need to know them. And so you went in search of it, and you said, I felt I was midway between two poles, constantly in flux as to who I was and where I came from. My body, like my lineage, was a mystery because I didn't have a full narrative from either of my two families. I was not confident in my identity and culture, a sense of loss to find both components. And so I want to ask, tell us a little about the search that you did, how you connected it to the larger issue of identity for Black people, and what it felt like for you.
Well, I will say that oftentimes when I write about myself, I write from a source of shame and work my way out of it. And with regards to my matrilineal line, I always just thought of the Northeast as the beginning and the end. I knew that somewhere in our family line, we came from the South, but no one ever talked about it. I don't know if it was because of trauma or just because there was a strict delineation between conversations and spaces where it was grown folks' business. And we just didn't talk about as much. And with regards to my dad's line, it was a little bit more controversial. I didn't live with my dad as I started the prologue of my book. My dad told me when I was 7 or 8 years old that he had 3 other daughters and he had a wife. And I knew nothing about it. I just thought he was a bachelor. So I already felt out of place trying to figure out how to reconcile both parts of myself within my respective families. And so when I took this trip to the South, I realized that there are sub-ethnic groups of African Americans that I didn't know anything about or had scant knowledge of prior to my journey. So for example, the Gullah Geechee people, Louisiana Creole people, which I found out that I have, ancestry in, but my father never talked about it. His father's father didn't really talk about it as much. And then I learned about freedmen, Black and Indigenous people were located on the western Mississippi because of the Trail of Tears. And it made me realize that I was part of something larger. The further I traveled across the United States, I thought that it was a pilgrimage of sorts, but it also made me realize that my life story fit into a larger story of American life, one that is not often taught in textbooks. And it made me realize that I also had a stake in these other communities. And there were so many broader implications and consequences of not knowing one's history and leaving those narratives up to white people and their institutions.
Thank you. Now, Frank, your book is not a search for identity so much as kind of, to me, it felt like a deconstruction of what we believe about identity. And I found it really interesting. I want to read a little passage from Afro-Pessimism, and then I want to put to you a question that a reader has asked. Black people at their best. Afro-pessimism is Black people at their best. Mad at the world is Black folks at their best. It gives us the freedom to say out loud what we would otherwise whisper or deny. The violence perpetrated against us is not a form of discrimination. It's a health tonic for everyone who is not Black. And in this time, that kind of rings really true as we're wrestling with all the issues we are now. Can you tell us briefly how you come to Afro-pessimism, and is it as pessimistic as it sounds?
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to the LA Times for having me, and Emily and Morgan. Hi, again, like Emily said, I wish we were all here in person together, but it's probably healthier that we're not, so.
Sorry. Sorry.
Sandy, should I continue? Or? Am I? Oh, okay. All right. So the first thing I want to say is that the Afro-pessimism is the title of the book, Afro-pessimism, but it is also the moniker for a critical theory lens, like Marxism or feminism. And it's been around for at least about 20 years as a lens of interpretation. And so that's what I really want to get out there first, because when people there are two types of people that have read Afro-pessimism. One is the people who are probably the most people reading or coming to this particular event, who are invested in trade books. But then there's a whole slew of publishing and academia type folks who have been reading Afro-pessimism for some for the past 10 years, some for longer. And so it's really not necessarily a word, Afro-pessimism, that designates an emotional condition of despair. It is a clinical, analytic word that suggests that there's a pessimism of the intellect. So it's two books in one, actually. There's a critical theory, which is first, and I think, Sandy, the word you use, deconstruction, is spot on, because it deconstructs the assumptive logic of psychoanalysis, which is the foundation for a certain brand of radical feminism, and it deconstructs the assumptive logic of Marxism or historical materialism, which is the basic foundation of assumptive logic for most left-wing political struggle. And it doesn't say that these two things are wrong. It says that they are inadequate in describing Black suffering. So Afro-pessimism is a theoretical interpretation, and in the next 10 years, there are going to be perhaps 20 books which are mainly written by political theorists. Some will be written by visual artists and sculptors, that will say more about what I'm trying to explain here, the theoretical side. And it suggests that the thing that civil society, whether it's in Europe or Latin America or the United States, has never been able to grapple with is the simple fact that Black bodies are positioned by structural violence inside of civil society and experience performative violence like police shootings for very different reasons and very different conditions than, say, other bodies of color and the white working class and white women. And that we haven't done enough theoretical work on what we call the grammar of suffering. What is the structure of suffering for Black people? And how is it we make the case through, and when I say we, there are tens of people out there, but mainly in the academic world, who are writing books and articles that make the case that suggests, that argue that anti-Black violence cannot be analogized with the violence of white supremacy that other people experience. And the next most controversial claim, which I won't get into the proof here of, is that slavery is a relational dynamic which did not end in 1865. We have to think of it differently, and it continues on to today, and that the slave is necessary. I mean, the slave is necessary for the psychic presence of everyone else. So what the theoretical argument is that Black people function as a necessary foil that allows for everyone else in the world to say, no matter how bad it gets for me, I am still a human being, because if I wasn't, I would be Black. There would be gratuitous violence against me. So that's half the book. The other half, and I'll stop here, is I'm trying to deploy this theory through my other hat, which is a creative writer, and to tell stories about my own life, which are resonant with the structure, with the kind of universal structure of Black suffering. And I think that's important for me precisely because, you know, a good Marxist would never say that someone who is middle class and works for a wage does not suffer under capitalism. But most people in the United States and Britain, and I've traveled around the world and taught on 3 different continents, and I think that the problem with American education and existence is that we lean so heavily on concrete examples that we don't actually have what in critical theory and political theory is called cognitive maps. And a good cognitive map on the structure of suffering will deal with a person who looks least like they're suffering as opposed to a person who looks most like they're suffering. And so that was one of my projects about narrating the theory of Afro-pessimism through the stories of my life, which were not stories of poverty. And so I'll stop there. I think that's it in a nutshell. It's 2 books in one, and it's blended together so that sometimes you're reading stories and sometimes you fall into a critical theory analysis.
I can only imagine the challenge in doing that. And I think, though, what that does is it does connect us to the bigger, not just the history, but the bigger of philosophical kind of concept of Blackness. And we had a question that came through that is specifically directed for you. So I'm going to ask that now while we're here, Frank. It's from Simasa. And she says, Dr. Wilderson, how do you feel about people categorizing your book as a book about Black experience? Is that the word you would use? And if not, what other designations would you consider more true to the theoretical thrust of the book?
Well, I must say that Samasa is a brilliant graduate student at UC Irvine. I don't know how he got his question in first. Because normally in class, when something happens, I do a shrewd pedagogical move and ask him to answer the question rather than me. Okay, so it's a devious question. He knows the answer to it, and I think it's a very helpful one. Thank you, Samasa. So I think that in the book, the first 3 or 4 chapters are basically grounded in storytelling. I have a master's in fine arts in fiction writing from Columbia University, and that's my passion. And I have a PhD in critical theory from UC Berkeley, and I'm passionate about that, but that's more or less my job. And so I can understand, directly answering the question, I'll say this very succinctly. I can understand how someone can pick this up and think about as primarily a book about my experience as a Black person, because it's a trade book. And as a trade book, it's written to be sold in places like Book Soup and Barnes and Nobles. And so I want to invite the reader into suspense, into intrigue, into what in creative writing is called thrusters and cliffhangers. It's a different way that I started my second book, which was a critical theory book par excellence, which is based on analysis, right? And so I think that because so many memoirs are really meant to be stories of an individual experience, someone could think that that's the game that I'm after. But once you get to chapter 3, 4, and 5, you then begin to start to understand that whether you speak as Samasa does, the language of Benin and North Carolina, where his lineage comes from, or whether you speak Creole, where Morgan and my people come from, or whether you speak Spanish, if you live in civil society with Black skin, just like if you work for a wage, you suffer in the same way, because I am going to be on record as saying I've lived in Guatemala for a spot, Trinidad, Cuba, the country that I love more than any place in the world, the United States, South Africa, Vienna, Germany. Anti-Blackness organizes everyone's reality wherever you go. And so that's why I would think it's misleading to think of the book as being the goal being about experience. Actually, the goal is about the structure of suffering, whether or not a person is Black and considers himself conservative or liberal, revolutionary or reformist. The suffering is the same. My last point is that Frantz Fanon said it best in The Wretched of the Earth. He said the native, and he's talking about the post-colonial native, and I would transfer this to the slave or the Black. The native doesn't always tell the truth. In other words, what he was trying to say is that there are people who are Algerians who could be as much for French occupation as the French are, and there could be people who are Algerians who could be against French occupation. So he says the native doesn't always tell the truth. The native embodies the truth. What does the native embody the truth of? The native embodies the truth of the settler's undoing. And what he means by that is that regardless of what the native thinks about occupation, and I want to bring it back to Blackness, regardless of what Black people think about an anti-Black world, if the Black body were to be redressed, if the deep, deep suffering that we have experienced from 625 AD when the Arabs started the slave trade to 1452 to today, if our suffering was to be redressed, then the world would not exist as we know it, because the theoretical argument of Afro-pessimism is that Afro-pessimism the anti-Blackness rather, grounds everyone, grounds them, makes them present, makes them whole, and makes them know that they are alive because they are not Black.
Well, we are going to come back to that idea because I think it resonates with Black Lives Matter and all that goes on. But I wanted to ask Emily, because you talk about the truth and we embody the truth. And I think, Emily, there was a line in your book about the situation is not the story, or does that make you recognize that it's how we feel about things that is kind of the story and the truth? And can you tell readers a little about your family and the truths that it has taken you to have to address, that you addressed in your memoir? And for the rest of us too, if any of this sparks you to want to say something, feel free to jump in, because we're going to have a conversation, not just talks.
Okay, I take that line from a book by one of my heroes, Vivian Gornick, and her book is called The Situation and the Story. It's the art of personal narrative. And in that book, she talks about the situation being the circumstance, sometimes the plot, and the story being the thing that the writer came to say. And I remember reading those lines and thinking, okay, this is the project. And her work has been immeasurably important to me. But I think for me, I think of the poet Sterling Brown, who said, every I is a performative I. And thinking about, for me, writing first person narrative, it's always about something bigger. It's not ever the story itself of a particular life, even, no matter, how complex or how many turns that life takes, but really, how does that life connect to larger stories? It's something that motivates me. So I write about myself as a way of trying to touch something else and trying to find connections with other lives. It's, to me, that line is always shifting between self and other. And it's something that keeps me really pulled back to the page to try to discover the limitations, but also the possibilities. My book, I think, is so much about intimacy and about a longing to know, not only to work through my own sometimes contradictory feelings about questions having to do with identity, but really to invite. I like the word, I think Frank used the word invitation, or I think about that with my work as well. I'd like it to be an invitation for a lot of different stories to come and join.
Morgan, you go also to the South. Both of you in your memoirs go back to the South and either acquaint yourself for the first time or reacquaint yourself with things. What is the South to us as Black people? Because, for the large part, that's where most of our families started. What does that mean, and why is that so important? Why is that? It's kind of a staple of Black memoir in many cases. What does that mean? What do we
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say the motherland. I don't want to say that because that would be, just sort of extricating ourselves from, the West Africa, the African continent. But the South is everything. I'm thinking about that with regards to the election right now. I'm thinking about that in my own life story. It's full of so much life. And I feel like me as an African American, I'm indebted to the South. But I also made sure I had to humble myself during my journey, because I had to realize that, yeah, I can say that the South is not homogenous, but when you really go down there, you touch down that soil and you listen to the cadences of people, and you gauge the landscapes and the flora and fauna of different states, you really understand how vibrant the South is. So I think no matter where you are in America, if you're a Black person who's generations deep in America like I am, you have a tie to the South some way, whether it's the food you eat, whether it's the dialects that you speak, the music that you listen to, and we're all cosmically connected. I think about a quote that something that Maya Angelou said years ago in Jet magazine, I think it was talking about how Black people were starting to move back to the South. And she was saying that Black people are hearing a siren call. And I think that was so powerful, thinking of the siren call, like something always pulls us back there. And so that's what I think about when I think of the South.
How did visiting there change you, if it did, or how did it influence the course of your memoir and the course and how you and your life?
It made me feel whole in more ways than one. I think about, for example, when I went to Louisiana, my father's family originates from St. Martinville, St. Martin Parish, and my dad has never been there. And I remember him like messaging me like, what else did you find? And it was eerie finding my family names in certain archives. And I remember I went to a festival, and I'll back up and say one of my liaisons, and I'm talking about someone who was like 17 generations deep in Louisiana, was like, don't be surprised if someone recognizes you and can tell which parish you're from when you go down there. And I thought to myself, that's not going to happen. I'm multiple generations separated from Louisiana. That's not happening. And I remember I went to a festival in Louisiana, in Lafayette, and somebody looked at me and was like, are you from St. Landry Parish? And I was like, no. And St. Landry Parish isn't that far from St. Martin Parish. It's probably about a little bit more than an hour, somewhere around there. And someone said, it's because of her half moon eyes. And it gets me emotional because my eyes are like my father's. Every time I take a picture and I smile really broadly, so my cheeks always go up and you really can't see my eyes like that. My mom was always like, when you smile, she's like, open your eyes, like I'm trying. And I take pictures with my father, we have the same eyes. And people used to always recognize me in South Jersey for these eyes. But it was only in Louisiana that someone gave them this like poetic description. And it made me feel recognized in a way that would not have happened had I just stayed in New Jersey and tried to do this work in libraries. So it was a way of coming back home and me recognizing that no matter how long I've been away or my bloodline has been away, I can always come back home.
That I don't imagine this is unique to Black Americans, this kind of search for identity, but I know that where I'm engaged in the same thing now. We have family land in Alabama we're trying to figure out what to do with. And it kind of, the strength and the resilience that you see when you go back and when you explore your history, kind of to me acts as a counterpoint to the bad attention that we get and the racist things that are happening, and a reminder to me that we're bigger than that. And Frank, since your book is kind of that we're, permanently, stuck in this world that has racism at its core, is that a legitimate kind of thing? I mean, is there a way to kind of build ourselves up in ways that it doesn't matter so much what the rest of the world thinks?
Well, I thank you for that question. I can understand how reading the book, one might think that it's kind of the condition of anti-Blackness is divinely ordained and that we're here forever, because it is a condition. I mean, if you think of the condition of capitalism, which saturates the globe and oppresses people on every continent, it's only about 300 to 400 years old. But anti-blackness is about 1,300 years old. So there's a sense of permanency. It is not ordained by God. It's, you know, I don't believe what Elijah Muhammad said, that the white man is the devil and that and all of that. But I do think that it feels like that. And I think that what Afro-pessimism as a theory and my book as a combination of theory and memoir are trying to do is to say, again, I want to repeat what I said to begin with. It's not pessimism of an emotional sort. It's pessimism of an intellectual / political kind of cognitive map that says, here's the way out of this. So the direct answer to your question, Sandy, is that Afro-pessimism, the work that people are doing in Afro-pessimism, and it is work that has saturated all kinds of spaces, like Black Lives Matter, like communities, Black communities in Montreal where I've spoken, like the high school and college debate community. I mean, that's completely saturated with Afro-pessimist theory, and the humanities and social sciences. It's not saying that this is divine condition, there's no way out. It was constructed by people, but with an ocean of violence that is not going to be negotiated out of. It can be undone. And that's what I hope my book and all the other people who are writing critical theory and political theory, not necessarily in the memoir genre that I'm writing, who are writing Afro-pessimism, they're doing all this labor so that it can inform, it can deepen our sensibilities as Black revolutionaries and understand that the Band-Aid reforms that we put on ourselves with respect to changes in policies do not actually put a dent in the structural anti-Blackness of the world in which we live in, but it can be undone. It's just that I would say you can't write a sentence about what the other side of anti-Blackness will look like. Like you can write a sentence about what the other side of capitalism looks like. I teach Das Kapital at UC Irvine. Marx has this sentence. You can write a sentence about what the other side of patriarchy and homophobia looks like. But the argument is that anti-Blackness secures the relational dynamic in the collective unconscious of everyone in the world. It is constructed, but because it is a global epistemology, you cannot actually say at this moment what the other side will look like. But we're writing these books and doing the labor because we know there's another side. It's just that the move to it is going to be really, really massive and unpredictable.
I want to ask a question now that came in from one of our viewers. It's from Felicia. And I think it fits in right here now as we talk about, why we do this. And she asked, as Black writers, do you feel a responsibility to help white readers understand your perspective? And I want to ask you that first, Emily, because you are living in Vermont, you are living among white readers, you interact a lot. How do you feel about that? Is that a role and a responsibility of Black memoirs?
I don't think so. I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's a question that preoccupied Black writers since the inception of Black writing. What is our relationship to our readership? Be it a Black readership, white readership. Of course, now thinking beyond those boundaries. Hopefully, I don't think that we owe our readers an explanation. I think we owe our readers honesty and integrity. I don't think we owe them, sort of a simple path through the stories of our lives as Black people. Our lives are complex even to us, the people who are living them. So I'm not a fan of simple explanations. I'm not a fan, I think, of placating readers. I don't like to give simple answers. I think that the questions often are more compelling, and I think people need to do their own thinking. So in my book, Black is the Body, I think I practice a kind of refusal to do that, to make easy, conclusions to simply satisfy and placate, again, any kind of reading public. I want to, create a space for the reader and me to kind of move through the world, move through the questions together. So I don't think that we do owe them, any reader, a simple kind of a playbook through Black experience. And I think that readers who need that should ask why, when there are no easy answers. And, when all of us are living complexly. So the reader has to be committed to the long game, and teasing out the questions and looking at themselves and not necessarily looking for Black people for answers. I think it's a mistake, and I think we see it happening a lot, but it's a mistake for white readers to imagine that a Black writer can give them the answer. We made this mess together, and everybody bears a responsibility to figure it out. And it takes courage and it takes failure. So I think I reject that absolutely. That, and certainly not the kind of writing that I want to do. I want to ask questions, and I want my writing to be useful, hopefully, in any reader's attempts to make sense of this world. But if I don't offer, nor do I think I owe a tonic for any reader.
You give the sense that you are figuring yourself out kind of in this book as I read it. Tell us about, there's a moment where you have your two daughters who you were adopted from Ethiopia when they were infants, you're very young, and you come to grips with the fact that they are not brown, they are realizing they are Black, and the kind of mixed feelings you had about that. Can you kind of briefly tell us about that?
Well, it's fascinating to watch my daughters grow up, and I think often about the phrase, Laura Jones's phrase, the changing same. My daughters are born in Ethiopia, and where to live in Addis Ababa is and to be Black in Addis Ababa is a very different experience, of course, than to be Black in Burlington, Vermont, in the United States. But they have certainly now they're fully conversant, in the history of African American struggles, and call themselves Black and see themselves as very much allied and really part of that narrative. They don't see any kind of distinction anymore. And that is part of where they are in I think their learning experience in the world. But when they were young and coming to understand themselves, it was only then that I recognized that the trauma that had been part of my racialization, my coming to understand my own Blackness, which was a consequence, like Morgan, the roots in the South, and growing up for me, smack in the middle of desegregation, with all deliberate speed in Nashville, Tennessee, and living a life that felt we were always imperiled. Even though my parents, I realize how much work it must have been for them to create a sense of safety for us, in the middle of Nashville, Tennessee. But they did, and I had a sense of security in my childhood. And I understand now the work it must have taken. I watch my daughters leave the house now, and my heart is in my throat. But at the same time, their experience of Blackness is really different than mine in ways, we will understand as we all grow together. But my experience of race in those early years, I think it was not unusual, but it was about, constantly understanding that we had to protect something. There's something to be protected that was not protected in the outer world, or something that was protected in the family. And watching my children now and understand themselves as Black, there's so many experiences they're having that I could, it's as if time doesn't exist and these generational differences don't exist, but they are really different, and they are Black in a very different way, in the same way that I'm Black in a different way than, Frederick Douglass was Black. But we're all Black together, and we're all sharing this experience, but the particulars are really fascinating to me. And so my daughters have a sense of themselves, of course, as global citizens, because they are, my daughter used to call herself, I'm an African who lives in America, I wrote about in one of the essays. But as she gets older, and I think as their experience in this country, of course, becomes more intense because of what's happening politically, that has sort of disappeared, and really now she sees herself, she talks about the we, and we were slaves, and we, and I watch it literally through language, understanding yourself as part of a larger narrative. And that has to do with me and what we experience together, and also what they see and how they are making decisions they're making about what Blackness means to them.
Thank you. Morgan, you did a really great job of kind of weaving in history lessons in your memoir as you discovered things and then you explained kind of the why of them. Do you feel, I think that was probably really educational to a lot of people. Do you feel as a Black writer that you have a responsibility to help white readers kind of understand our experience and perspectives?
You know, I want to say yes, but I'll also say that I'm kind of a hypocrite. When I was writing this book and going through the copy editing process, I was gaslighting myself a bit, because some of the things that I saw, the stories that I heard, I was like, nobody's gonna believe me. And I didn't even want to believe it. And for a lot of the trip, I was by myself in hotel rooms with these recordings and these photos. And I was like, I just was, it was hard to emotionally process. And so for me, like, I don't want to say that it's my job as a Black writer to help white people understand the experience, but I also have to remind myself that, you know, one of my editors, I had two editors. One of my editors was white, and I'm published by a Big 5 publisher. And I know there's a decent amount of white people who read my books. And so there was a part of me that was like, how are they going to understand it? Even as I'm learning all this Black history. I remember I actually looked at a review that a Black woman put on my book on Goodreads, which I don't say that writers should do that, but I just wanted to see. And one of the things was, like, the woman said was, she has so many citations. It's like she thinks no one's going to believe her. And I'm like, yeah, that was it, because it was just devastating. So it's a matter of, when I think about Wandering, for example, I do think that I wasn't only trying to get white writers to understand, I was trying to get Black people to understand, because I wasn't taught this history. Black people who I opened up to about this process, they were like, I didn't know so much of this stuff. And it's like, it's kind of by design that we didn't know it. So yeah, I will say that like overall, no, I don't think we should handhold white people's, white people to get them to understand our experiences. But I will say, with this book that I made, that was a hybrid of memoir and also history that I wasn't privy to, I was trying to get them to understand as I was trying to understand myself.
This is, you know, we've talked about how tense things are going today. So I want to put in another question from a reader, and I mean, from a viewer, and any of you can answer this. And this is from Harold. And he asks, in the wake of this incredibly close election, do you see the Black Lives Matter movement continuing to flourish? Is the anti-racist message getting through? And, you know, I think when I think of that question, I think about kind of the hope all summer when people were protesting all around the country, people of every color, and it felt like it was an inflection point. Do you see that is now diminished, and also what is our role as writers and as creatives in kind of communicating during this time?
I'm not sure the anti-racist message is getting through, and the reason why I say that is because of the election. And I think about how, last night I made the terrible decision of watching the New York Times needle and watching the votes come in. And to be in a country where a man, our current president, has over 66 million votes, it makes me, and also the fact that 55%, as opposed to 53% of white women in 2016 voted for Trump in 2020. I don't know. It makes me wonder, like, all of the anti-racist lists that came out, all of the books written by Black people that were on the New York Times bestsellers list all throughout the summer because of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I don't know. It makes me think about what Frank was saying about suffering. It's like, after all that we've been through with COVID-19, with, police violence, it's like, what's going on, what's happening. So that part is I'm personally grappling with myself, that in spite of all of that, there are some people that are still intent on Black people suffering, because at least it's not as bad as that. You know, I'm okay with this, at least it's not that bad. And with regards to Black Lives Matter flourishing, it's hard for me to think about that, because when I think about Black Lives Matter, I think about it was started because of Michael Brown's body in the street for hours. And I'm thinking about, if we have to keep doing this again and again and again, more of us are gonna die, and it shouldn't take that. And as a writer, it's difficult because I started my career 6 years ago writing publicly online. I started with writing personal essays and hot takes about police brutality. And that was one of the only ways for young women of color to make it in the industry or get a foothold in the industry. And as a writer, it's difficult for me now, because I'm like, how many times can I say, stop killing us? How many times can I say that there's an historical precedent for this? How many times can I say that, you know, it's just not enough to put a hashtag, there has to be more? So that's something that I'm grappling with, like, how many times we have to keep repeating ourselves?
Yeah.
I want to echo, if I could, what Morgan is saying, because I really think that's really, really, really important, and it kind of speaks to the premise of Afro-pessimism as a theory, and the assumptive logic of my book as a memoir/theory. I mean, I fundamentally believe that America has never responded to the discourse, meaning the ideas, the ideology, the demands, the verbal and written articulation of suffering of Black people. So I don't see this as a different period than, say, 68 or before that, Emmett Till. I mean, I'm 64 years old, and what I have seen in the past 64 years is patterns of the American state and the American public responding to Black agitation. I do not see patterns of America responding to Black ideas, Black agendas, and I also think that it is psychoanalytically impossible for the collective unconscious to imagine that people with Black flesh suffer and can be injured. I think that in the collective unconscious, our music, our dance, our writing, our singing, and our bodies are deemed to be extensions of the master's prerogative. What do I mean by that? To put it very succinctly, a little girl says on the playground, Black girl says to a white girl several years ago, my daddy can whoop your daddy. And the white girl says back to the Black girl, yeah, but my daddy owns your daddy. And that is the foundation of the collective unconscious, whether you are, as I heard Joe Biden describe today, I just love this, a neoliberal corpse, like Joe Biden, or whether you are an outstanding racist. There is no redemption for Black people in this country. It's just not possible. Abraham Lincoln said it at the end of the Civil War. I mean, everyone knows he fought the Civil War to save the Union. And then he says, when he's promoting his colonization program to send everybody to Liberia, he makes a poignant statement that connects his preconscious mind with his unconscious mind. I cannot imagine Black bodies as part of civil society. He's speaking for the country. There's no reforming that. That's the essence of what it means to be American, to be anti-Black. And I just want to say one last thing about the question of what our responsibility is to white writers, and it's nothing. I mean, if anything, the world, we don't owe the world anything. The world owes us everything. Once an undergraduate in a class, when I was decrying the end of welfare that was brought about by Bill Clinton, the first Black president, and this young white woman says to me, are you saying that people should get something for nothing? That's not American. I said, well, no. It's extremely American. That's why you're here, okay? This university, this city of Irvine, California, the country, the gross national product, you got all this for nothing, stealing, robbing, being parasitic. That's what it means to be an American. Now you don't like me as a Black person wanting something for nothing. You're not against people getting something for nothing. It's the American way. You're against Black people getting something right. So let's clarify that.
Well, you know, I when I read your book previously, months ago, I felt like, boy, this is pretty, you know, pessimistic and down. But I tell you, I woke up this morning thinking Frank is right. But what do we do in that scenario? If that's the structure of our country and that's the way it's always going to be, what's left for Black people?
I think I don't mean to contradict you, Sandy. I'm very sorry. But I think that what the four of us are doing right now is not nothing. I have spent the past, I don't know, since 2008, going all over the world doing workshops for Black political organizers in Cape Town, Johannesburg, Vienna, Berlin, London, Montreal, on Afro-pessimism. That is the Black agitation on the ground for reform, which they're not going to give us, right? But it builds a space for Black people coming together to talk in a revolutionary manner and do a revolutionary analysis. And that's not nothing. What we have to do is we have to, I think, and this goes back to something that Morgan was saying, that 10 years ago, I went to a family reunion in Louisiana, and I had an opportunity to go to the archives in Tulane to read my grandfather's papers, Frank Sr., and he started the NAACP chapter in his parish. And what I could see from that, he was a very savvy person because he had the opportunity to become president or treasurer. And the paper suggests that he decided to become treasurer so he didn't have to keep taking the train to New York and getting schooled and disciplined by Du Bois and all those people about what he should be doing, so that he could be doing on-the-ground organizing where he was and have the power to move against the machine. And that's what I've been doing all of my life, okay? Even as I write a tome, and I've written 2 other books and articles that suggest that this anti-Blackness organizes the world. But I would also say struggle, and then you put the word protracted on the front of that, protracted struggle, so that you don't have to, the payoff is not freedom from anti-Blackness in your life. Because if it took 1,300 years to build an anti-Black world, I don't think I'm going to see it. The insurance adjuster said I should be dead last year at the age of 63, right? I don't think I'm going to see it, even if I live beyond what the insurance adjusters say about me. But I'm damn sure going to work towards it and put protracted on the front of struggle so that other Black people come along and put protracted on the front of struggle. And we just keep moving and being uncompromising in our movement.
That's great. And that's the history of us in this country, too, and how we move. And thank you for that. We are getting close to when we have to end. So I want to get a last question in from a viewer. And this is from Jill. And she's asking, what advice would you give to fellow Black writers trying to break through? And do you think there is real change happening in publishing now to allow more diverse voices to be heard?
Well, let me put it like this. Morgan's dilemmas were my dilemmas also. Here's what I've had with I've been fortunate with 3 books and their final editors in that. So I'm going to answer Jill very quickly, so give other people some time. I would say do your best to stick to your guns and not allow the editor to massage your text in such a way that it speaks to a broad range of people in their comfort zone. If you're writing in English, anyone who reads English can understand your work. If they don't know something factual about the Black condition and they live in this country, well, then shame on them. We've been here for 400 years and we're the foundation. They need to go to the library and find that stuff. It's not on you to adjust your book to the sentiment of non-Black people and what they can hold. This is precisely why, if you read James Baldwin's article, The Black Boy Speaks to the White Boy, this is precisely why he broke up his friendship with Norman Mailer, because Mailer could only hear about suffering that was analogous to the type of suffering he had. And you got to make editors understand that you are writing a Black book to a Black consciousness. Anyone can buy it, but you're not going to massage your book to meet the stomach and the emotional needs of other writers. That's a hard thing to do. And I can tell you, I've lost a lot of money sticking to my guns on this, okay, in terms of advances over the years. But I'm fortunate that I found an editor for this book, and I found it for all the books, but the first editor I found for this book was a gem. The other two books, I had to go through a lot of machinations of holding my ground. And the next thing is, don't spend the advance before your book is in press, because they will come back to you and say, change this because it makes me as a non-Black person uncomfortable. And if you don't do that and you spent that advance, they own your book. And that happened to me.
That's great practical advice. Thank you. What, Morgan and Emily, do you have any advice for Black writers trying to break through, or any lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, don't ask for permission. Like, don't wait for somebody to say, you know, come on, hop on this train with me. Just start writing. Read other writers too, particularly contemporary writers. If you're a younger writer, I say this as someone who, you know, younger millennial writers who are on the internet, do not be beholden to the internet when you write. And the reason why I say that is a lot of times on the internet, we don't allow grace in the same way. We don't allow the depth of contradictions or, you know, just growing within Black experiences. So make sure that, like, when you do decide to write, listen to that inner voice and tune all of that out, and to work on your craft, to practice your craft. With regards to publishing, like, I do think there are some changes. I don't know how long lasting they will be, but I do know that there was a lot of reckonings happening across the industry, across many different industries addressing race and racism. And there was a hashtag called Publishing Paid Me, and where Black and brown people were talking about the events that they had. And there were some big stars that talked about it, including people like Jesmyn Ward. And ever since then, there have been increases in advance offers for Black writers. I have been seeing a lot of that, and just more book deals that have been happening for Black writers. I hope it's sustainable. It's publishing. There's still a problem with regards to editors and those who are holding high positions that are Black, not many of them. And that still needs to change. But I have seen some glimmers of light.
Definitely glimmers of light. Absolutely. And I would say that it's also really wise to be acquainted with the history of African American writing, and again, within a larger white publishing industry. You know, all the issues we're talking about and have been experienced by generations before us. I'd just like to speak briefly to the question. I guess it's a similar thinking about what it means to be a writer. Just like Morgan said, you just have to do the work and stay committed to the work and find your voice. And I think try not to be swayed by the demands that are always shifting, or perceived demands from readers, all the expectations. You have to stay true to that voice, because that is going to be with you to the grave. And I also want to say something about what our work is, you know, to kind of testify to the truth of our experiences and to make sure we leave a record. I think that for me, you know, despite everything else, I know that I have to keep returning to the page. I mean, despite the despair that I experience daily, you know, the only thing that keeps me moving forward is thinking that I'm going to stay true to the narrative and true to trying to understand. And I do that on paper. And, you know, it's something, regardless of whether or not we can change others, we have to stay true to this fight. I know I'm going to die trying to be connected, to stay firmly planted in the world and on the page. That is my ambition, and I'm going to see it through to the end.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating for me as a writer and a fan now of all three of you. I want to end it. I want to just ask, because I'm curious, and I bet readers are too, about what you're reading now. or who your favorite author is, but particularly what are you reading now and why? If you have time.
I had occasion recently to reread Frederick Douglass. I brought him up earlier, but I realized, his command of the English language is tremendous. And I realized how much my early writing was spent trying to imitate what he could do on the page. And Frederick Douglass, writing in the context of, every possible horror, still put together beautiful sentences and precise metaphors. And if I can just do something like that, that is it for me, to be able to go back to him.
Great.
So I just finished reading Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I highly recommend that book. It's just, the language and the tone are just so entertaining. And I'm about to read The Black Jacobins because time is of the essence. It's about the Haitian Revolution. And so I thought that I would read something like that.
Following up on Morgan's Black Jacobins, okay. I'm reading Assata by Assata Shakur. I've taught that book every year in different places in the world since it came out in 1987. I'm teaching it tomorrow. Assata Shakur, as most people know, is a member of the Black Liberation Army. She's about 10 years older than me, I guess about 74. She may have 3 bullets in her chest from a shootout on the Jersey Turnpike. I went to Cuba in 1998. I wanted to meet her, but bounty hunters were going to Cuba to find her, so she was underground. But that book has informed the structure of my memoirs. So I keep returning. I return to that every year for classes and for myself, Assata. And I'm also reading FBIs. That's F.B.EYS by William Maxwell. And that's a book about how the FBI created the most sophisticated and well-resourced Black literature department in the world, where they study Black poetry, Black creative nonfiction, and Black fiction. And they have, for 101 years now, they've been putting a rotating detention list of Black writers on this list on which Black writers should go into concentration camps should things be kicking off again. And so this is a highly FBIs by William Maxwell, which describes how the FBI is actually the first Black literature department in the world, not Yale or not any university, and what they're doing with it.
Wow. All right, well, thank you. And thank all of you who joined us. I'm sure you learned something today, and I imagine there's going to be a line for your books. This has been an important conversation, particularly now, and it's elevated, I think, our understanding of Black memoir, which is becoming more and more popular. So thank you all. Thank you, Emily Bernard and Morgan Jerkins and Frank Wilderson, for joining us. And remember, please, when we're done, to support our local book-selling partner, Book Soup. If you order your books through them, you will get a signed book plate from these 3 writers. And that's something that'll be valuable. And it assures that you'll get it back when you pass it along. So thank you guys very much. And looking forward to the rest of the panels that are going on during the festival, our 25th annual book festival. And we say good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.